Welcome to the New Life Ministries podcast. During times like these, where there is heartbreaking war going on in the world that doesn't seem to have an end, it can be easy to lose sight that God is still in control. Daniel chapter 11 talks about wars that go on for 300 years. War is an experience that is shared by people throughout history. So how do we respond? Let's get into Daniel 11 with Curtis.
All right, so let's look at the Bible. Today we're going to look at Daniel chapter 11, which, if you have a New Living Translation giant print Bible, is on page 1342. Daniel 11. So today's passage is long and it's hard to follow. And it walks through, so I've set you up. It walks through several hundred years of battles between two nations. And it's hard to figure out what to do with a passage like this. And one of the people that I read this week was told when they were in school that there is no way to preach Daniel 11, and it's best saved for a Bible class. So let's tackle it. The problem is the tendency is to pay so much attention with who's attacking whom that we forget to pay attention to what it's trying to say to our soul. So I'm actually not going to spend a lot of time on who every person is and what the historical reality is behind each verse. I'll add a few here and there just to help us stay in touch with reality. But I invite you to notice your soul and your feelings. It's a long story. You'll likely get lost. Don't worry. You will still get the point. And here's the point. Has anyone watched the new Percy Jackson and the Olympian series? No, it's good. At one point, Percy fights Ares, the god of war. Have you ever seen a show or read a book where somebody fights Ares, the Greek god of war? You've heard of Ares, the Greek god of war before? Let me ask, do you suppose the Ares, the god of war, ever dies? And now you understand chapter 11. So let me give you a setup. Remember last week we read chapter 10, which is the intro to this huge vision. And there's a spiritual being telling Daniel what is going to happen. And it's an answer to Daniel's prayer. And we're not given the prayer, but we know he's lamenting his nation's struggle with being faithful to the Lord their God. And so this being is saying, yep, and this is what's going to happen. And let me give you a rough outline. The passage covers from the fourth king of Persia, which is Xerxes, like the Xerxes, who gets defeated by Alexander the Great, and it goes up to Antiochus IV. So we're going from 480 BC to 165 BC, or 300 years-ish of history in about 30 verses. And most of it is a battle, or a series of battles between the king of the north and the king of the south, which is how the passage calls it. The king of the north is the Seleucid dynasty. It's a series of kings from the land of Syria today. And he's in battle with the folks from the Ptolemy dynasty, which is the land south of Jerusalem, which is Egypt. So it's this series of battles with Syria and Egypt over 300 years. But don't worry about all the details. I can give you a book that covers many pages of how every piece of this is true. Instead, pay attention to how you feel through it and what it says to your soul. You with me? Okay, let me offer a prayer. Father, this is a thick passage, and in some ways it is really hard to know what to do with it. But in other ways, we know that you are helping us to understand something about being human and what it means to be your disciples in the world. So would you bring clarity to it? And would you speak to each of us in the peace that you want us to ponder from your word? Yeah, glorify yourself. Amen. Choke. Okay, Daniel chapter 11. And I'm going to start with verse 2. Because verse 1 is really part of the intro. So this is the spiritual being speaking. Now then, I will reveal truth to you. 3 more Persian kings will reign, to be succeeded by a fourth, that's Xerxes, far richer than the others. He will use his wealth to stir up everyone to fight against the kingdom of Greece. Then a mighty king will rise to power who will rule with great authority and accomplish everything he sets out to do. That's Alexander the Great. But at the height of his power, his kingdom will be broken apart and divided into 4 parts. It will not be ruled by the king's descendants, nor will the kingdom hold the authority it once had, for his empire will be uprooted and given to others. The king of the south will increase in power, but one of his own officials will become more powerful than he and will rule his kingdom with great strength. Some years later, an alliance will be formed between the king of the north and the king of the south. The daughter of the king of the south will be given in marriage to the king of the north to secure the alliance, but she will lose her influence over him, and so will her father. She will be abandoned along with her supporters. So this is Bernice, who is the daughter of Ptolemy II. And he was clever. He's like, let me give my daughter to the king of the north. That way they'll have a child, which will be my grandchild, who will reign over that throne. So this is the long plan, right? I'll gain power through my grandkids. But she ends up getting divorced and her children are killed. So verse 7, but one of her relatives, her brother, becomes king of the south, and he will raise an army and enter the fortress of the king of the north and defeat him. When he returns to Egypt, he will carry back their idols with him, along with priceless articles of gold and silver. Some years afterwards, he will leave the king of the north alone. Later, the king of the north will invade the realm of the king of the south, but will soon return to his own land. However, the sons of the king of the north will assemble a mighty army that will advance like a flood and carry the battle as far as the enemy's fortress. Then, in a rage, the king of the south will rally against the vast forces assembled by the king of the north and will defeat them. After the army is swept away, the king of the south will be filled with pride and will execute many thousands of his enemies, but his success will be short-lived. A few years later, the king of the north will return with a fully equipped army far greater than before. At that time, there will be a general uprising against the king of the south. Violent men among your own people will join them in fulfillment of this vision, but they will not succeed. Then the king of the north will come and lay siege to a fortified city and capture it. The best troops of the south will not be able to stand in the face of the onslaught. The king of the north will march onward unopposed. None will be able to stop him. He will pause in the glorious land, intent on destroying it. He will make plans to come with the might of his entire kingdom and will form an allegiance with the king of the south. He will give him a daughter in marriage in order to overthrow the kingdom from within, but his plan will fail. So this is Cleopatra, not the Cleopatra, but she goes south. She goes south to do the same plan, get married and have a kid, but she falls for the king and falls for Egypt, and so she betrays her father and stays there. Yeah. And so she becomes like one of the lineages of Cleopatras that finally we get to the Cleopatra. So like a great-great-great-great-grandma kind of thing. Verse 18, after this, he, the king of the north, will turn his attention to the coastland and conquer many cities. But a commander from another land will put an end to his insolence and cause him to retreat in shame. The other land is Rome, that is just beginning to build power. He will take refuge in his own fortress, but will stumble and fall and be seen no more. His successor will send out a tax collector to maintain royal splendor, but after a very brief reign, he will die, though not from anger or in battle. He gets poisoned. Verse 21, the next to come to power will be a despicable man who is not in line for royal succession. He will slip in when least expected and take over the kingdom by flattery and intrigue. This is Antiochus IV. Before him, great armies will be swept away, including a covenant prince. He kills the high priest in Jerusalem. With deceitful promises, he will make various allegiances. He will become strong despite only having a handful of followers. Without warning, he will enter the richest areas of the land. Then he will distribute among his followers the plunders and wealth of the rich, something his predecessors had never done. He will plot to overthrow the strongholds, but this will only last a short while. Then he will stir up his courage and raise a great army against the king of the south. And the king of the south will go to battle with a mighty army, but to no avail, for there will be plots against him. His own household will cause his downfall. His army will be swept away, and many will be killed. Seeking nothing but each other's harm, the kings will plot against each other at the conference table, attempting to deceive each other. But it will make no difference, for the end will come at the appointed time. The king of the north will then return home with great riches. On the way, he will set himself against the people of the Holy Covenant, the people in Israel, doing much damage before continuing his journey. Then, at the appointed time, he will once again invade the south, but this time the result will be different. For warships from western coastlands, Rome, will scare him off, and he will withdraw and return home. But he will vent his anger against the people of the Holy Covenant and reward those who forsake the covenant. His army will take over the temple fortress, pollute the sanctuary, put a stop to the daily sacrifices, and set up the sacrilegious object that causes desecration. Remember a couple weeks ago we talked about how he set up a pig in the temple and sacrificed it to Zeus? He will flatter and win over those who have violated the covenant. But the people who know their God will be strong and resist him. Wise leaders will give instruction to many, but these teachers will die in fire and sword, or they will be jailed and robbed. During these persecutions, little help will arrive, and many who join them will not be sincere. And some of the wise will fall victim to persecution. In this way, they will be refined and cleansed and made pure until the time of the end, for the appointed time is still to come. We're going to stop there. We're stopped there because the vision continues, but it shifts towards something future, and we'll hit that next week. So, how do you feel? Yeah. Do you notice the way the battles never end? Like it's a short-term victory and then retaliation. So I heard on TV just the other day some speaker who said, the war ends with our victory, whatever battle. The war ends with our victory. It doesn't. You might win this battle, but the story's not over. There will be another battle. So war is not final. War is not the end. And for all the fighting and the scheming, the results are not permanent. Your power or the power gets challenged and uprooted. There's a need for revenge. There's a need to get what you think is owed to you. There's a desire to get as much as you think you can get with your power. When the war is over, it's not over. Wars are never final. The God of war never dies. And you also notice how often the plans didn't really work that well. So commentator Dale Ralph Davis pointed this out to me, and I must give credit to him. But he noted all the times in the text the plans failed. So verse 4, his kingdom shall be broken apart and divided. Verse 6, she will lose influence over him, and she will be abandoned. Verse 9, he will invade, but will soon return to his own land. In verse 11, he will rally against vast forces. So he's going to go against an army that is huge, and he's going to win, because a big army does not mean you're going to win. But his success will be short-lived. Verse 12. Verse 14, there will be a general uprising. Violent men from your own people will join, but they will not succeed. Verse 17, he will make plans to come with the might of his entire kingdom, but his plans will fail. Verse 18, a commander from another land will put an end to his insolence and cause him to retreat in shame. Verse 19, he will stumble and fall and be seen no more. Verse 20, he will die, though not from anger or in battle. Like, it doesn't work. The battles are not particularly successful for all of the effort that's put in it to prepare them. So here's something to ponder. If you're waiting for the war to be over before you start being well, before you start focusing on being a better disciple, the war will never be over. And if you're really confident in your plan to win the war, and then when you win the war, you can focus on being well, you might not win the war. And let's apply this to more than just wars between nations, right? Because there can be wars at home, wars between children and parents, wars between spouse and spouse, wars within inside of yourself. Very good. There's wars at work. There's wars where you go to play. There's wars between conflicts and wars between leaders and wars between people who follow different leaders. And then there's the war we sometimes have as the world is a way that we don't want it to be. And so the war against what I want the world to be. If you're waiting for the war to be over before you become well, before you decide to be a faithful follower, the war is never over. I was talking with Pastor Brian from McDermott Avenue Baptist, one of our sister churches, and he said, there's no ideal Christian world. Like on this side of death, there is no ideal Christianized world where there is peace, where things work the way they're supposed to, the way things work the way we want them to. That doesn't exist. And the evil one is making the world as evil as he can make it. Like the world is as evil as the evil one can make it. And the Bible affirms that he's in control of a lot of places. And so Brian said, he noticed there's either one of two ways you can respond. As you age, as you live life, you either become hard and angry and you take a hard posture against the world, or you humble yourself and you ask Jesus to transform you. And you become kind and gentle and graceful and merciful. And take up knitting. But he said that's what he's observed. And I kind of have to agree. It's maybe a bit of an exaggerated example, but kind of like, what path are you on? Are you just building in anger and hardness against all the war? Or are you saying that's never going to end? I'm going to submit myself to Jesus and ask him to transform me. Which path are you on? So in this passage, we go through 300 years of battle between the north and the south. To get to the north from the south, or to the south from the north, you have to go through the land of Judea. That's the path. Because on one side is the Mediterranean Sea, on the other side is the desert. So for 300 years, for 300 years of battle, Daniel's being told there is going to be military traffic through your nation. 300 years of armies and soldiers, back and forth, needing food, making a mess, not always being polite to local residents. It's exhausting. But that's the reality that is going to be. And so with that, it's interesting to ponder their response, which we see in verse 30 to 35. And I'll just highlight a bit. Verse 30, this king will vent his anger against the people of the Holy Covenant, and he will reward those who forsake or abandon the covenant. He'll reward those who are unfaithful. Verse 32, he will flatter and win over those who have violated the covenant. But the people who know their God will be strong and will resist him. Wise leaders will give instruction to many, but these teachers will die by fire and sword, or they'll be jailed and robbed. During these persecutions, little help will arrive, and many who join them will not be sincere. And some of the wise will fall victim to persecution. In this way, the country, will be refined and cleansed and made pure until the time of the end, for the appointed time is still to come. I want to be sympathetic to their experience, because I get it, 300 years. And over those years, Greek influence is creeping in and changing their culture in a way that not all of them want. And they've not returned to being the great nation that they had always hoped that they would be. And they're getting oppressed, and they're getting overrun, and they're getting stolen from. And it's so easy to lose focus on who God has called you to be, and instead think about, what can I do to make my life a little bit better in this moment? Like, what's happening and what are the advantages right now that can make my life a little bit better? What do I need to do to improve? And you start surrendering, thinking about who God has called you to be, and you start just thinking about making it through. So do I have to, partner up with these soldiers a little bit, maybe betray some of my people? Do I need to steal from some of my people so I have food so that when the soldiers take from me, I can give, like I can be taken from? Like you're in a crisis of how do you do this? But that crisis is where we learn how to follow God on earth. And it's it's understandable to get really tired of being constantly surrounded by war. And it can drive a thought that says, I've had it, I'm going to join this group of soldiers and we're going to end this war and then life will go back to peace. But the war is never over. And so this passage is saying, look, remember your first calling. You have to look beyond what's happening in this moment to something greater. This passage is giving a warning. You have to be faithful to your first calling. Like, look beyond the crisis and the tension of this moment and say, okay, how do I be faithful to God in this? This is where I am going to learn to be faithful. And that's part of what this passage is getting at. Does it make sense? You with me? So I've been pondering lately if there was another way to do World War II. And I've been having this discussion with a few people. Because 50 million people died in World War II. And when it came to the German threat in Europe and the genocide of the Jews and the genocide of anybody who opposed the Nazi regime, was there another way to stop this outside of killing? Like, was killing the only solution? And it's particularly as a disciple of Jesus, what would be the path? And I don't have the answer, but it's been in my mind. So the other day, I watched a movie called Valkyrie, made in 2008, starring Tom Cruise. And it was a fairly faithful retelling of a group of German military leaders who were working to assassinate Hitler and stop the Nazi regime. And the story centers on Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg. And then after watching the show, my streaming service offered me a documentary on this whole story, which was great. So in the story, in this particular Operation Valkyrie, people in Germany were starting to see what was happening. This is it started around 1942, 43. They were starting to see what was happening in their country, what Hitler was doing, leading people, how the Nazi regime was not what perhaps it had initially started out to be. And they just realized this does not represent Germany. This guy and this army doesn't represent what we are about. And so they devised and executed a fairly brilliant plan to stop Hitler. But Hitler lived. And within 24 hours, many of the people involved in Operation Valkyrie were shot. And there was something like 700 people in the end who were part of this. But so many were captured and shot that they couldn't do follow-up interviews after to find out who all was involved, because they just killed people right away. But their families were branded traitors. They were traitors to the Fuhrer. And it was over the years, over decades, as the truth of what the Nazi regime had done came to light, and it went to trial, that people in Germany, and as people in Germany started to get distance from the war and could get a perspective of what had actually happened, slowly it became clear that those traitors were actually not traitors, but were standing up for what was right in Germany. But it took decades. And that's what struck me, is it took decades for someone labeled as who's 5 years old and your father's a traitor. And so for the rest of your life, you're branded as a traitor. And now that guy is 80 years old, 90 years old, saying, actually, this was the journey out of that. We don't think long term, but that's what we have to do. And this passage is telling people, war is not the final thing. How you behave during that war, that matters. Even if it only becomes clear that you were siding with God decades after you die. We have to have that perspective of what's the big picture calling of who I'm about, rather than what is the war of the moment. We have to be faithful to God's side. We have to be faithful to following God's ways, which sounds impossible, right? It sounds impossible to the idea of dying to truth, even if no one knows. That's what I've been trying to do. That's what I've been pursuing. And so one of my friends has been teaching about the difference in following Jesus versus good morality. And he said, often we approach life with, what are the new rules I have to follow to make Jesus happy? Or what are the new rules God wants me to do? What's my moral code? And he keeps saying, Jesus is trying to change the kind of person we are. That we would see the world as God sees the world and respond to the world the way God responds to the world. It's a transformation. You become unified with Jesus and you live this union with him as you live your life. And so we know that war is going to continue. What does it look like to live in union with Jesus and be transformed to be a new person in all of the battles that come our way? And it might make us afraid, it might make you afraid, because it sounds like I'm likely going to lose a bunch of battles here. Or I'm not going to fight the way I kind of want to fight. But one of the things we've learned throughout Daniel is that God is sovereign. God is always in control. And he, in story after story, whenever it seemed like evil and oppression was going to win, we realized at the very end, no, God was in control. And even in this passage, one of the commentaries I read talked about the number of times it's subtly hinted at God is still in control. And it comes out in the limits of time. In 24, he will plot the overthrow of strongholds, but this will only last a short while. Verse 27, it will make no difference, for the end will come at the appointed time. Verse 29, then at the appointed time. 35, for the appointed time is still to come. God's very subtly got all of this under control, and no one's going beyond what he's allowed in the time that he's allowed. So we can trust God is sovereign. I can let him transform me and not fight this war the way I would otherwise fight this war, and I don't have to wait for the war to end before I start being faithful. So let's discuss this. Where has this passage been challenging your thinking? Let me give you a quick overview. 300 years of battle between the North and the South. After one war, there is another war, and those wars don't go as planned. We can't wait for war to be over before we can be well. And that war might be between nations. It can be the war at home. It can be the war at work. It can be war against the direction the world is going. It just seems like there's two paths. Either you become angry and harsh over the course of your life, or you humble yourself before God and ask him to transform you, and he makes you kind and gentle and graceful and merciful. All of these wars are exhausting and frustrating, but it was the context for Israel to learn to be faithful to their God. We have to have a greater focus than just the crisis of the moment or the opportunity of the moment. Jesus is not calling us to a new moral code, but to make us a new person. And God is always in control. So what's been challenging your thinking in this passage? What's caught your attention?
I feel like when you read a passage like this, it feels like, yeah. It's like, we know, there's the Game of Thrones, right? Very popular. But it's exactly this. And whatever, this has been going on forever. All this says to me is when humans are in charge, this is how it goes. And you're talking about sort of two different ways of looking at it, or two different ways of allowing it to work its way out, or allow your heart to either become hard or choose to allow your heart to be softened and to stay soft. It seems that humans have never, not once, figured out a way to live at peace with each other, to extensively care for each other in a way that's actually beneficial. The only way that it seems that human systems have ever done a really good job of looking after people is when the person or people or group in charge doesn't see themselves as the ultimate authority, but recognizes that they are also under authority. And that it's God, however they understand God. And in our case, because God is a creator and who's actively still interested in his creation and loving and active in our lives, that is the character that he encourages and is willing to help us to grow in as we then become leaders and influencers as well. He's not like some people submit themselves to what they see as a very anarchic or very despotic God, and then they are allowed to act that way. But in our case, that is not the thing. And so for God to say, my people, sorry, you guys, you live right beside this highway that people are going to tromp up and down and up and down. That actually reminded me of our family story because my grandmother grew up in Lithuania.
Okay.
And in her the geography of Europe, the Russians would come through and they would come through and they'd beat off the Germans. And then 5 years later, the Germans would come through. And then 5 years later, the Russians would come through. And in my grandma's growing up, the Russians were the good guys and the Germans were the bad guys. But really, whenever the army came through, they would take all the livestock, eat all the food, they would wreck stuff, they would cause havoc and destruction. And the farm families, like my grandma's family, were highly impacted by this. But they saw one group as the saviors and one as the bad guys. But this is the same. It's like the Syrians and the Egyptians going up and down, and Israel's just getting, a lot of traffic going through. And God saying, you need me to be involved in this. You guys, it's not going to go well for you if you just, kind of ignore me and say, oh, that was just some tradition that our forefathers did. I'm sure it's very quaint, but whatever. Now we're modern. Didn't go well. It's fascinating to look back and to see the patterns and to see how similar they are.
At the very top of my notes, it says, reads like a George R.R. Martin novel.
Who? Oh,
Game of Thrones, yeah.
Okay.
And so it was funny. So that was what struck me first. How much this reads like Game of Thrones. And Game of Thrones dances with this whole issue of the fleeting nature of political sovereignty and people just pushing and pushing for what they think is going to be their own best interest without actually stopping to do anything to maintain that power over time. And so it felt a lot like that, where people as a whole have this bad habit of setting an endpoint and doing anything to get there regardless of who is injured and doing nothing to make that a long-term thing. You see this in to do with pushing kids towards college and doing all of these things where you're like, this is the endpoint. Once you get here, everything will be better. And that is never the case. Everything goes to heck after that. And so what jumped to mind is we often see ourselves being victims of other people doing that. The kids of the mom who's just invested in getting to that goal weight, who then struggle with eating disorders for the rest of their lives. The students of teachers who just push, if you can't get into college, you're dumb, and then go through the rest of their lives thinking they're stupid, even though they're not. They're wonderful and brilliant. That's not what they're made for. And so the thing I took from this was the importance of supporting other people who are being victimized by this tendency. I saw it in my own life, where you can act as the support to other people who are struggling with eating disorders, struggling with all of these other things. That is just how society works, pushing people down. And so, that was the importance of being victims together.
Except we're not entirely victims because we're also the bad guy.
Yeah, there's that.
It's good.
What kept going through my mind was that God is in charge. And that's what Curtis said over and over again. And when we yield to God being in charge, it gives us peace, it gives us joy, it gives us comfort. And we don't have to worry, even if there are wars in the U.S., and even if the government changes there, or if it changes here, or if we see deterioration in our government here, God is in charge. We can be at peace.
Yeah.
What Christine described with Lithuania was exactly what was going through my mind. The people in the middle of this, it's absolute chaos, because every time they come through, they consume the entire country as they pass through it. And yet, this was written before any of this happened. So they already knew, bad stuff's going to happen. But they also knew God's promise was yet to come, that there would be survivors, that there would be people of the covenant left at the end of all of this, and they could have hope. It's kind of, this was their book of Revelation.
Yeah.
The message of hope to us that says, you know what? All of this bad stuff is going to happen. Here's what's going to go bad. God never loses control. Yeah, beautiful.
Nice.
Yeah, just building off what other people have said already. I think the first thing that struck me was, in my life, how often am I saying, oh, once I get this work done, then I'll have more time. Or once I'm retired, well, then I'll have more time. Or whatever the story I'm telling myself is. And so that really struck me. And so then how do I follow Jesus now, in the middle of it, in the midst of the war? How do I remain faithful? And so that was kind of my first thought, and I find that very challenging. The second thoughts came on a more of a theoretical level, in that these things pass in and out of our life all the time, and there's the temptation to align with power. And so I'm going to join this army, and I'm going to join this army. And I had a grandpa who spoke beautiful German and Russian, and that's exactly what he did during World War II. He could translate. And so the Russian front would push through, and he would switch to their side. The German front would push back, he'd switch sides. So it was a very, very dangerous life. And one of the generational, if you want to call it a generational sin or a generational issue that came out of it, was there was an issue of secrecy on one side of my family that was damaging. And so I think we need to be reminded that we're part of a larger story. And it's at times like this where God feels silent. And so you think of Israel, these armies pushing back and forth through. Oh, come on, this is God's land. Like, where is he? What's he doing? Well, he told you ahead of time so that you can know he is still in charge and that you can be faithful here. He hasn't left. He's given you a warning ahead of time. So I guess I take comfort in that. I see the church throughout history supposed to be like a straight arrow. And there's going to be these influences, but we don't align with power. We don't align with which government is in. We're to be faithful to Jesus, no matter what's going on. And I've heard people say that here. And historically, we've done a very poor job of that. And so I'm hoping that we can improve, and maybe us here can improve in being a follower of Jesus when these wars are going on all around us. And we are influenced by them because we're supposed to be part of the world. So God help us.
Beautiful. Let me offer prayer. Father, thank you for Daniel 11 and the craziness of this passage, but the message that's in it, that if we just let it sit to our soul, sink into our soul, we know that war is not final, and we can't wait for our war to be over before we start being well, or before we take seriously following you. Jesus, thank you for sharing your life with us, and not only taking away our sin and our corruption, but giving us, like legally giving us your righteousness, but then working through the Holy Spirit to make us be what you are, be who you are. That as we live life and engage in what's going on, we are like you, abounding in love and kindness and grace and mercy. So Lord, as we participate in communion, we remember what you have done for us. So thank you. Amen.
Thank you for listening to our podcast today. New Life Ministries is located in Winnipeg, Manitoba. You are invited to join our service in person or over Zoom. Please use the Contact Us link to send an email to the church office and request the address or Zoom link. If you would like to use these podcasts as part of your home church or local church gathering, you are free to do so. We do request that you let us know. If there is any other way that we can help you in your ministry, please send us an email.